It's official. We're on the live. How exciting. Every time, gets me every time. I am going to go ahead and just pull up our essentially the video on my phone. So we'll get to follow the comments, but welcome everyone. We're so excited to have you here. We have such an exciting conversation and real talk coming through today. So as you're hopping on, thank you for joining us. Please drop comments and questions in the chat. We want to hear what you have to say and would love to incorporate it into today's conversation about language and Latinx identity development. So, and kind of our formation and kind of how they come together. So we have some special guests with us today. So let's start off with some introductions. Jenice, do you mind starting us off?
Yes, so my name is Jenice Ramirez. First, thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful conversation. I'm super excited to take a deep dive. I am the Executive Director of ISLA. I've been with ISLA now for 7 years. And so my background, my family is Puerto Rican, and I have been all over. I'll get a little deeper into a little bit about where I grew up and such, but a lot of my work has been centered around education due to me going to school for education. And yeah, and I'm just super excited to be here and to talk about something I'm extremely passionate about and is really the foundation of what ISLA is. And just so everyone knows, our mission is to build leadership and community through educational programs and culture immersion programs. And so we really dig deep into what is identity, what is our Spanish language culture, Latin American culture. And so, yeah, I'm excited to share that with you all today.
Awesome. We're so excited to have you, Jenice. I can't wait to even dig into more about ISLA too. So looking forward to that. And Lina, thank you so much for also joining us. Do you mind also introducing yourself?
Not at all. Hey guys, my name is Lina Palancares. I'm really excited to be here. I'm one of Latinx's college coaches through our new initiative, College y Consejos. But this past year, I just completed my master's at UChicago, where my research was on Latinx identity and Spanish language in the US. So this conversation is something that I'm really excited about, something that I've read about a lot and talked to people a lot. So Jenice, I'm also really excited to hear about how you're coming at this work. Yeah, and I'm excited for all your questions. Elaine, I know we have your students on the call too, who have been really kind of been having these conversations. So I'm really excited to jump in. My family roots, I was born in Mexico. I moved to Atlanta when I was 10. So I kind of have this experience of being bilingual and bicultural in different spaces, where my native language has kind of really shifted throughout my life. So yeah, excited to talk about this today.
That's awesome. It just occurred to me that we have 3 different cultures represented on this call, which is really cool to hear kind of the different journeys, because it's different, right? And I think even though we're often lumped together, like there's so many nuances. So I'm really excited to dig into that too. So I'll introduce myself. Hi, everyone. My name is Elaine Townsend-Uten. I am one of the co-executive directors of Latinx Ed. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second, but a little bit about me. I was born in Peru, but raised in the South. So Georgia, Arkansas, North Carolina. And that journey, especially being raised in predominantly English speaking spaces, has definitely impacted my journey and my relationship to language and English and Spanish and my own kind of Latinx identity formation. The journey, it's very much intertwined with also being raised in the South. So that's part of my journey. I'm excited to kind of dive into that with you all too, for us and our journey being here in North Carolina, Georgia, et cetera, and kind of where those spaces have raised us in many ways, or how they've impacted us. So my background's in education. So I studied in undergrad and also in grad school. And so I'm really pumped to be able to tie in all of those pieces in the work that we do. So it's a nice transition into talking a little bit about Latinx Ed, and we'd like to give our audience, and I got to give some people some shout outs already because we have some people here in the chat. So welcome Emily and Esperanza and Bibi and Maida and Eden and Elena and Isabella and people are here. Okay, they came in strong. Daphne and Sydney, welcome. Anna, Parker, Ben, just the crew has showed up. So we're so excited to have you here. Please continue to drop comments or even if it's a reaction or something that we say resonates with you. That is really helpful to know kind of how our journeys are maybe intertwined to or share commonalities or differences as well. So we're going to be representing our own journeys and kind of the work that we do, but there's so many nuances to this conversation. So before we start with the questions that we've prepared for today's conversation, we want to give everyone just a snapshot of our work and kind of where our background is and just dive a little deeper there. So today I'm representing Latinx Ed. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to amplifying the lived experiences of Latinx immigrant families here in North Carolina, but specifically to break down educational barriers. So we do this through our college access work. Lina already talked a little bit about College y Consejos, and she can share a little bit more about kind of who can get involved and things of that nature. We also have a program called Somos Carolina, and it's all about positive racial ethnic identity development. So really getting in touch and with the strengths that we get from our culture and who we are as Latinos, Latinas, Latinx, Hispanics, et cetera, right here in the South in particular, and then connecting that to our roles as leaders and learners in our communities. So it's a really exciting program. And we also have a podcast too, highlighting history here of the Latinx community in the South in particular. So those are a few shameless pieces of our work, or plugs for our work. And so I'd love to turn over to Jenice to tell us a little bit more about ISLA in your work.
Yeah, so like I said, I'm the executive director of ISLA. I've been with ISLA for 7 years. ISLA has been active for 8 years. Recently, we got a new mission and a new vision, and our mission is to build community and leadership through our educational programs, Spanish language and cultural immersion programs. Our vision is that we visualize an equitable society strengthened by the power, knowledge, and value of Latin American languages and cultures. And, you know, one of the things since ISLA began in 2012, the idea was just that it was a space for heritage language learners here in North Carolina. And it's grown to be much more than that. Our Heritage Language Saturday program is primarily our largest program, but we have many other smaller programs that have come from that. And it's come from the community, really listening to the community. So we have our Padres Isla program where we support our families through different workshops based on the needs of the community. We also have our SEPA program that is a fee-based program for our children who want to learn Spanish and want to learn the culture. And then we also have our Hora de Español, which is our community outreach events. And then we also have community and advocacy programs. Right now, every Tuesday, we get on in partnership with Pablo Friedman from DPS and other individuals in the community to talk about COVID, to talk about reopening of schools, different needs of the community. We've also recently launched our podcast. You could find it on all podcast platforms. And within this podcast, there are multiple series, but the one that has been, now we're going into episode 5, I believe, is our Isla Jóvenes. And this is produced, created by our youth. And it's talking about racial issues, it's talking about voting rights, it's talking about the importance of voting. And we have amazing people on that talk about their experience, right? Navigating this system and really understanding where our youth is coming from and giving opportunity for our youth to be able to use their voices and ask questions. And then we also have within that podcast a series that are Cuentos con Isla. And so we take different Latin American stories and we change them up Isla style and we put them out. They're about 7 minutes. We have one out right now that was based on a Peruvian story. And then this next week, we have another one that's based off of a Colombian tale. And it is also produced, created by the Isla community. So I'm really excited about where Isla is going. And really, one of the most important things to me is that our youth are prideful of who they are, where they come from, where their families come from, and most importantly, see their language as a tool that they have in their toolkit and that they're able to use it in every single way every day. And so I've been lucky enough to get to use it here at ISLA. And so, yeah, I'm excited about sharing even more of that in the questions that we go through today.
That's awesome. I always get so hype when we talk about our work because there's so many connections, and I feel like this work is so needed in North Carolina, and the impact that you're having on families is incredible. So just so excited to be in the trenches with you, Jenice. This is awesome work. And so Lina, we'd love to learn more about you and also your master's too. I just feel like super relevant to this conversation. So would love to hear more.
Yeah, so I'm also here repping Latinx Ed today. As I was mentioning before, I'm one of the college access coaches for a new initiative, College Consejos. So we are providing culturally relevant college advising to both juniors and seniors throughout the state of North Carolina that identify as being Latinx and also usually are first generation college students. So kind of helping them navigate this process. Also right now, they're dealing with a lot. It's really stressful. So how can we be there to be an extra resource to really guide them through what's usually a stressful process, but right now is really being compounded by a lot of different things that are happening. So I came in through this work via activism with a lot of immigrant groups. So I worked a lot with Student Action with Farm Workers in North Carolina, and working with them really learned a lot about working with young students, just learned a lot about tuition equity and the barriers that the Latinx immigrants and especially undocumented and documented students face when applying to college. For me, being an immigrant, I knew that it was difficult navigating that and figuring it out, and having had neither of my parents finish their college degree in a different country, and trying to figure that all out by myself was very difficult. But I had US citizenship, so it's not a barrier that I ever had to worry about. So I understood kind of levels as it related to my personal story, but was super lost about the different barriers that everyone else faced. So I became really passionate about learning more and about using kind of my ties to the community to really be an ally, understanding that I still came at this with some privilege. So I graduated from Duke in 2018, and I did college advising corps the year after that. And again, really got more into the weeds about what it meant to apply to college without documentation. It was really frustrating working with undocumented kids who didn't have perfect grades and didn't have the perfect SAT score, because they deserve access to education as well. Everyone does, especially in a country that's built on this promise of opportunity. Really seeing that not everyone has the same access to those opportunities, and that was really frustrating. So I wanted to kind of keep being involved in this work. So I completed my master's degree this past year, and really wanted to study more about Latinx identity and how nuanced it is, especially being how diverse our community is, how it's made up of different colors and different languages, and how there's really not one way to define being Latinx, but people still try to do it, right? So how can we start kind of digging out that word, because I think it does come with some power where we can have a lot of solidarity between us, but we also need to understand that there's differences between us, and that we carry different privileges and we carry different marginalized identities. So it was really cool getting to do that research, because I got to talk to a lot of people to seeing how they defined their identity. And I'm excited to hear about the people that are tuning in, to seeing kind of what kind of words do you bring with you? Like, how do you define your Latinx identity? How do you come into this community?
Oof. Already juicy, setting us up, Lina. Thank you. I too am super curious with our audience too on like where these pieces are landing with their own personal journeys. So I am super curious. So shout out already. We have Tatiana joining the conversation. Valentina, welcome. Brian, let's go. Juanes, welcome. So we have the crew is here. I'm excited to dive in. Our first question is really, I think, going to set the stage too with our own personal journeys as we think about the the nuance of language too. And right, yeah, I think so often it's, you know, we talk a lot about Spanish too, and so we have also that piece to unpack, Spanish's role too in Latinx identity development or formation, English, Spanglish, indigenous languages. There's so many other pieces to that puzzle too, though, so we kind of kept it broad, or the topic broad, because I think we can go a few places with this. But the first question is really just getting into that personal journey, your own personal journey. So what was your journey with language like? What was that? Maybe did you grow up speaking certain languages at home, and was that different than school? Just super curious to learn more. And maybe Jenice, could you start us off?
Yeah, so a little bit about my background. So like I said earlier, my parents are Puerto Rican. And so my dad joined the military when he was 18 years old, right out of high school, to, you know, have more opportunities. And so he joined the military and we moved all over. So soon after he joined, I was born, and I was born in Germany. And so in Germany, I remember my parents always tell me the story that when they were, because that was his first duty station, when he went to Germany, and I was sick, I was a baby, he had to tell the doctor that I was sick, and he didn't have English. English was a struggle for him, right? And so he was like, you know, my trying to navigate this world. And so at home, we grew up speaking majority Spanish when we were children. But I always say that I grew up learning both languages at the same time, because I was immersed in the US, right? Like we moved from Germany, we went to Texas, from Texas, we went to Panama to Alabama, Alabama to North Carolina. I mean, we moved a total of 11 times in my youth. And, you know, one of the things that I always remember is when we lived in Alabama, I was one of the only Latinas in my classroom, and we were reading a story, and the story was bilingual. So it was the Spanish up top, the English at the bottom. And I was just so excited that there was Spanish in this book. I was like, oh yes, finally. And the teacher asked me if I can read in Spanish. I was like, of course I can. And I was not reading. I was looking at the pictures and coming up with my own story, because I couldn't read in Spanish, but I was so proud of my language. And as I grew up, I really, I always just held on to that pride of speaking Spanish. But when I went to Puerto Rico, which we went regularly, of course, I didn't speak Spanish good enough. Right. And so there was, as I grew up, as middle school happened, as like I stayed connected to my friends in Puerto Rico. We actually lived in Puerto Rico a year. That identity crisis of I'm not Latina enough, but I'm not, I don't always fit in at school either, right? Because in my space, there were different, depending on which school I was at the time, there may not have been very many Latinos, or there were, but they didn't speak Spanish, or their culture was different. And like Lina said earlier, you know, I didn't realize how different people's experiences were, right, growing up, and how the Latino community was so diverse. And so, you know, it was my development of language. When I started this job, I remember thinking to myself, oh my gosh, like I have to speak in Spanish out loud to a group of people. I try to hold that confidence, but if we were doing Facebook Lives in 2013, in Spanish, it would be a whole different show than the Spanish lives that I do now, because my Spanish really was very rusty. And but I knew that if I wanted our children to have that same orgullo, right, of being Latino and using their language, I needed to be orgullosa de mi Spanglish, that my Spanish, my English. I had to show that pride. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about how that unfolded.
That is so real. That piece about, especially being in a position of leadership, and one that is also so personal, right? Like, especially with language, and for us, it's also like identity, right? Identity development. We also carry the same identities of our students in many ways too. So it is such a personal experience, but that requires us to do our own work and our own growth too, which is such a key part of the journey. I feel like that is the story. How do you say, like the piece about all educators too, or anyone that's in a position that is in the field? It's like we have to be doing our own work and our own evolution at the same time. So that super resonated with me. And Lina, I'm curious too, how has your journey been with language? What has that been like?
Yeah, pretty wild. So as I mentioned, I was born in Mexico. My mom was actually an English teacher in Mexico. So I think a lot of the experiences that people have here learning Spanish, I had in Mexico, because she would speak to me in English and I'd respond in Spanish, because I'm like, everyone around us is speaking Spanish. Like, why do you want me to like speak English to you? This is so annoying. But like really she was just trying to give me an extra leg up in life. She was trying to give me a boost, like especially like we didn't really see ourselves moving to the United States, and in Mexico, just like having English as a skill like will open a lot of doors. And I was so annoyed because like no one else's mom made them do that. Well, fast forward to 2005, my dad got a job offer to come work in this place called Atlanta, which I had never heard of. I didn't know what Georgia was. I vaguely knew what Florida was because that's where Disney World was, right? So it was the state above Disney World. That's where we were just moving to. It was a pretty quick turnaround. I think my dad like applied for this job in like August, September, and then by October he was going to be moving. And then we followed him in December. So it was a pretty kind of like, just like your whole world just turns upside down. And I had never been on a plane, and my first plane ride was not exciting for me. It was saying goodbye to my family. It was a lot of tears on the plane, and then getting out of the plane, I'm like, oh, I'm not gonna understand anything. But turns out all those years of my mom drilling in those language lessons had really dug in. And I was lucky enough that I was able to be on scholarship at the school that she taught at, which was a bilingual school. So I came to the US knowing English, not knowing any like fancy vocab words, but like enough to get by. And so we got here December, started going to school, I think like mid-January. And the same day that I arrived, another student from Mexico had also arrived, and he didn't know any English. So what they decided is that they were going to put us in the same class so that I could help him out. So me trying to figure out this new school system, this new country, this new reality that I was living in, turns out like I was doing pretty good, because like at least I knew some English, where this other guy that was coming in, he didn't know any English. So I came in and I was like interpreter from day one while he was kind of trying to figure stuff out. And they kind of started pulling him out to go to ESL classes and stuff like that. And because I was doing pretty well in comparison, they kept me in normal classes. They did initially put me in remedial math, but math like was my thing. So tested out of that pretty quickly. But then that also made me realize, looking back, that there are a lot of assumptions about skills that you have based on if you are an English learner, right? So because I was coming from a different culture initially, the assumption that was made was that like I must not be on the same math level, where a lot of the stuff that they were learning in math I actually had learned already. So I think looking back, and as I have gone deeper into studying this at a university level, and looking back, seeing how kind of educators and how the educational system fails students that are bilingual, and usually like they're defined in terms of being deficient, that if you speak another language at home, that means that your English is suffering. And they're not taking into consideration that actually these students have a huge language repertoire, that being able to communicate feelings and emotions in two different languages actually gives you a lot more words to be able to really define what you're feeling. Because, I don't know, you guys have probably felt it too, that sometimes if you're feeling super angry, like it comes out in Spanish, or sometimes, feeling super sad, I like listen to some music in English. So I feel really lucky to kind of have different vocabularies to pull from.
That's huge. That you sparked so many memories for me when you were sharing your story, Lina. So what I'll do is I'll share a little bit about mine and actually transition us into this next question, which is like how language factors into Latinx identity development. So we'll start getting explicit there. So for me, my journey with language is very much tied. It's like that parallel with identity is so strong, of like the high points, the weak points. Language was also a really big factor in that. And I've joked a lot, especially when I was younger, that I felt like a girl without a language. Like I felt like I could never, like my English always came out funky. My Spanish was coming out funky. And I think part of the reason for that, even though I was born in Peru, I came over to the US when I was really young. And both my parents too, while they were both born and also raised in Peru, my mom is, her ethnicity is Peruvian. So her heritage, she's from Peru. My dad is a missionary kid, so he's American, but born and raised in Peru. So English, my mom started practicing English when she was in Peru, kind of similar to Lina and this, your mom kind of in her journey, what it sounds like with English, of just trying to learn. And also for me, when we came to the US, she had also a little bit of a leg up because she had been really working hard in her own studies on learning English. But I think part of that, kind of the process of assimilation to the US, definitely manifested in my experience with language, because one, I point out first and foremost, one of my earliest memories of language, especially Spanish, was the things that you teach like a baby, right? So your eyes, I have all these little videos where they're like, ¿Dónde están tus ojos? And I'm like, here, it's like all those kind of little cutesy things that I remember from being young. And then when I got a little older, Spanish turned into the secret language that my parents would use to like communicate when they didn't want us to know. They'd be talking in Spanish. I was like, wait a minute, let me pay attention a little extra, because what are y'all trying to say? So then it was like a game, because then I was like, okay, let me figure out what they're talking about. And at the same time, my mom and in some ways my dad too, right? Even though he was raised in kind of both Peru and then sometimes in the US, being able to come back home to his family and stuff like that. But it was just English took over, it was what we needed in school. It's what we needed to, navigate the rural area in Georgia that we were in, so that became the dominant piece. My grandparents would come and visit, and that was the main time where it was like, I really need Spanish. So then I would start trying to, pick up pieces just to communicate. Still, my grandparents speak Spanish and little English, even though my abuelita, she knows more than she lets on. I'm like, y'all don't, be careful what you say around abuelita, because she gets it. But those pieces, right, of like trying to connect, Spanish was such a important piece of my relationship with them. And so that's when I started kind of picking up words. But this piece about Latinidad, or like Latina identity too, I remember feeling like when I would try to say some things in Spanish, I used to get like just little jabs here of like, you're not saying it right, but it wasn't in like a very nurturing way. It was a little bit more of like a joke, or kind of like laughing because it was kind of funny or things like that. But then I started to get really insecure about it. And so then I would stop practicing, or I stop until I got to high school and I was formally taking it in school. And then everyone was like, wow, your accent. I was like getting all this like praise for it in my, beginner Spanish class, because I knew I could understand so much. It just, my grammar was always like, I didn't know why I said the things I said, why they, I just didn't understand the reason for things like grammar. And so then I started learning more about that. And then I took it in college, and I just felt, but that level of confidence was always somewhat low, and also very kind of like, not necessarily, well, I would say shame was a part of that, because I just felt like I could never say it perfectly. And I was scared of being wrong, or like, being made fun of or teased or whatever. So it just started to take kind of a back seat. And I feel like now as an adult, there's moments where I'm like, I really wish I had just pushed past that, because I feel like I missed out on some opportunities there. But going back to Peru was super helpful. I went back when I was in college, and it was just, none of my family members that I was with spoke English. And at the time too, I had such a mixed relationship with English. I was just like, English, I want Spanish. I really wanted to learn Spanish and be immersed in that. And so English started to get really frustrating. Then I was stuck for 2 weeks without any English. And I was like, wait a minute, I miss English. I was like having that was like, wait a minute, let's check it out. So I feel like that piece that Jenice, and maybe if you could take us next on this, is that feeling less Latina and that journey definitely was a big part of my memories of kind of being, you know, in Spanish speaking spaces with other Latinos and not feeling like I could communicate really well, but then feeling like that made me less than, or I wasn't entirely part of the group. So curious on like how you, and maybe it's in your work or personal journey, have seen language really factor into that Latinx identity.
You know, I think, and I mean, to your point, I have felt all of that. And also what Lina said, I have felt that, right? As I think, even now as an adult in this professional world where I use Spanish every single day, I get the, where's your accent from? It's not Puerto Rican. You know, where is this from? Or why do you say things this way? Or maybe you should use this word, you know. And I think one of the things that I love about language and our connection to language, and that I try to really instill in what we do at ISLA, is that it really connects us to our roots, right? And as we learn about Spanish, we also learn about all these indigenous languages and the beauty of them, right? And where they come from. And I sometimes I think to myself, what else about our culture is so beautiful, right? Our language is to me number one, but then we got food, right? Then we got, you know, we got our music, we have how we talk to each other, how comfortable we all are. It doesn't matter. I don't care what Latino you talk to. You come into a space and you realize that someone else in the space is also Latino. You're like, oh, hey, you know, you get that, you know, there's something about this comfort that exists. And as I, you know, grew up, to one of the things that Lina said about having to translate for someone, being in military schools all the time. I remember when I was in middle school, I had just moved to Fort Bragg, and some people came from Puerto Rico also, and these students had zero English, and I was made the translator, the interpreter. And I remember being so excited about that, right? But then after a time, I was like, well, why just me? I wanna be with my friends over here. I wanna do things. And it started to pull me in different directions where, hold on, maybe me speaking Spanish isn't such a benefit, right? So let me act like I really don't know how to translate this, or let me act like I can't do this, right? Then, you know, another situation I remember when I was younger, when we first moved to North Carolina, I was put in ESL because of my last name. My parents had no idea, you know, that that ESL was for second language learners, no clue, because at that time they were still learning how to navigate the system. And I remember sitting in that class and making cupcakes. I came home one day and I was like, hey, Ma, I don't think I'm supposed to be getting out of math class to go make cupcakes. Like we, you know, me and Manolo's my middle brother, we both speak English fairly well. And there was, you know, not fairly well, we spoke it well. And there were other people in there that were in the same boat as us. And I realized that my language was being looked at as something less than English, right? And something that was so dear to me, that I was so excited about being somewhere else, and, you know, in Alabama, reading out of this book that I could not read in Spanish, and then feeling like, wait, how do I navigate this? How do I decide? And it wasn't until college and even now, you know, where I really realized that being bicultural, and I could consider myself bicultural, and sometimes I will say tricultural, because I have my Spanish world, my English world, and then I got this world that we navigate, right? And I look at that as, I can't see that as something less than, and I can't let what our society that just doesn't know any better create this space of really linguistic oppression, right? Because when we talk about what happens to our students in classrooms, it's a real issue. And I could go into a ton of examples that happen within ISLA, our families that go through this, but really being able to put our finger on it and say, you know what, it's okay that I navigate this world, and this world. And I think somebody just put in the comment, third culture kids. Absolutely, right? Like we're sharing this space, and being able to put a finger on it, and being okay that, like Lina said, not all of us have that same experience, and not all of us have that same identity. So somebody might say, you know, I always say I'm Latina, like that is, and someone else might say I'm Latinx, I might be Latino, I might be Hispanic. And so I think us being okay with what we choose to identify as our culture, within this Latino culture is beautiful, and we should embrace that more, I think. And I hope that answered the question.
You nailed it. You nailed it. And I think, well, I'm going to hold back on my second follow-up question because it's probably going to tie into our third question. But Lina, do you have anything to add to, especially with your thesis and kind of what you're seeing, pulling from the research?
Yeah, no, I think like Jenny said, we can probably go on about this forever, but I think whenever it's hard because obviously there's this kind of like external pressure around language and like how it should sound and how it should be spoken, both from the American side of things and then from the Latino side of things, of like the self-policing that happens between us, of like, oh, like where's your Spanish from? It sounds kind of funky. And the experience of going back home and like feeling like, oh, like I'm really going to be able to use my Spanish now, and then feeling uncomfortable with it, and then coming back and then the English doesn't feel right. And so then we like get into our own heads and start policing our own language and start putting these unrealistic fluency standards on ourselves, when really it's a lot of like, am I getting my point across? Do I feel like I'm part of this community because I've had these cultural experiences? Like, can I just claim it? Can I just let all these other expectations of people fall away, and can I just say, this is who I am and this is how I speak, and am I getting my point across? And I think when we kind of like liberate ourselves from that, it's a lot easier to start advocating for others. I think especially in a US context, thinking about a lot of the Latinos that speak Spanish at home, but then maybe can't write it or speak it as well, then you're like, well, I'm not a true Spanish speaker because I can't read or write it. But then you have tons of people in Latin America that don't have access to an education past like the first grade. Like, can they read it or write it? Yeah. Are they Spanish speakers? Yeah. Like, even if they can't, like, so when we start imposing kind of these things on ourselves, then we're also imposing them on other people, whether we mean to or not. So when we invalidate our own language practices, you're invalidating the language practices of a lot of other people, again, whether you mean to or not. So I think, like, very cheesy, corny, but like the change does come from within. And I think the shame factor too, of like feeling like you're not good enough. I mean, once you kind of get over it and it's like, am I getting my point across? Yeah, like, am I gonna have to maybe explain myself 3 times because maybe I said totally the wrong word? Maybe, but like, you're gonna get me eventually, and that's all that kind of needs to happen, because that's what language is, right? Communicating your point.
Mm. That Lina, you just went so many good places that I feel like we're going to keep drifting on, because well, there's a few pieces. One, the fluency levels, like who decides like which level of fluency is what, right? Like that piece, that really resonated with me, because I think my level of fluency when I was in college was probably much higher than I actually thought it was, in the sense of the standards out there and kind of how people do its assessments based on language fluency. But then I had peers who were not Latina or Latinx, that were rating their fluency super high. Like their confidence was out the roof. And I was like, wait, I know I can communicate a little, more fluently than this person, but their confidence is like another level. And I'm over here being like, I just can't claim fluent. I can't claim fluent. And they're claiming, it was just like, that part made me really reflect on where my insecurities were coming from. And then also, I think so I moved to Korea right after I graduated from undergrad. And that experience was really taught me a lot about actually my insecurities with Spanish in particular, because Korean, there was nothing I could grasp on. Like English and Spanish, there's connections there that that overlap, that I was like, I never felt like I learned a language from scratch or in school. That's just not how I felt. But Korean was like completely new. And then going through that very humbling process of like literally learning an alphabet from scratch as an adult was super humbling, right? Because there's this, and I think that's part of where I was like, where is the pride that I have in myself about, making mistakes in Spanish that is holding me back, but being able to just let myself be a beginner and make mistakes in Korean was also, all these dots started connecting, and I was like, these are, I think I think part of it was this fear of failure, insecurities. And as I started to let those go, I just also, the healing within me started to translate in how I interacted also with other people. And I was very often to give that like, I was maybe not compassion, but like the consideration. Like I'm super patient with other people when they're trying to communicate with me, but for some reason I couldn't give that, that patience to myself in that communication process. And so anyways, you're just making me think about a lot of my own journey and kind of my own evolution, which is tying into this next question here with where we're thinking about how to develop spaces and environments and facilitate spaces for learning environments in particular for other students that are also going through their own identity development and trying to connect to their roots. And in particular, we're thinking about Latinx youth here. And so Jenice, you actually shared pieces where you've seen linguistic oppression in action. And I think sometimes pointing those examples out is also really helpful for people who are in the educator facilitator role to be like, oh, that's the impact that was created from that type of exchange. But then also thinking about ways that we can shift from that linguistic oppression to culturally sustaining. Like how do we shift, and what are some ways, any thoughts you have honestly, but on how facilitators or educators can really think and move intentionally with how they are interacting with our young people, especially around language?
Yeah, so thinking about why ISLA exists is for that very reason, right? Because there wasn't a space for Latino youth to really grow in their language. It didn't exist. When we talk about in the Triangle area, there are Saturday schools that are Chinese, there's Korean, and this is what they do. They really focus on the development of that language here. And so with that, one of the things that I saw from the very beginning is not just about when you're working with heritage language learners, right? Where you're working with children whose parents speak a language and maybe they don't feel confident. There is a base there of language, right? And it's that what you talked about, that fear of letting it out. And so within ISLA, what we've really tried to do is create a space of confidence and seeing other students in the same classroom that have the same issues as them, quote unquote, right? Of being shameful of their language. One student talked about his culture of he thought it was a curse until he started coming to ISLA, because in his Monday through Friday schools, in his typical traditional educational space, his language wasn't valued, his culture wasn't valued. And so one of the things that ISLA really tries to do is to make sure that in this space where we're not only learning about our own culture, we're learning about the diversity of cultures within Latin America, we're building empathy within ourselves, but we're also building skills for advocacy, right? So when I go back into my space, I'm proud of my language. And I know that being bilingual, I actually have a skill that as a monolingual, you don't have. And so one of the things that I think our educators really have to do is take a step back and make a vision board of your classroom, right? And look at what are the cultures that are represented there and how can you connect and build your own cultural competence. I think when we talk about your own cultural competency, when we talk about university and training within education, right? This needs to become a very intentional class for educators so that you can really start thinking, how can I work and be intentional about the diversity that is within my classroom space. And if you have a Spanish speaking person or a person that speaks a different language, look into what bilingualism is instead of shutting down a child's language and a child's home culture and saying, you should stop speaking this at home because it's holding him back from learning English. No, the opposite. He's trying to figure out how to code switch. He's trying to figure out what is translanguaging, which is a real thing, right? And so I think that we need to be those guerreros, right? Those warriors of like, no, it takes some time to understand this, but we need to do our own due diligence as educators and figure out how can we create those safe spaces for diversity of language diversity, of cultural diversity that exists within a classroom.
Oof. I'm like, even that piece about like knowing who's in your classroom. I mean, that piece, I think when maybe people think automatically, maybe just like cultural background, but language background too, like language, in the languages that are being spoken at home, or the ones that they're interested in learning, or the ones that have piqued curiosity. How do we continue to expand? That's something that we've been talking about in our class. Instead of trying to replace language, expand language and really continue to grow our own horizons. Especially, I think there's that piece, as educators, we don't have to know everything, but how do we make those connections, or bring even a word or two to be able to build connection, create belonging in a space, because then we are really thinking about the whole student and what they get to bring to the space. So Lina, I'm curious if you have any other pieces to add too about from that piece as educators and facilitators are trying to make those connections in their spaces.
Yeah, I think something that for me is huge that I was thinking about when Jenice was talking is also whose multilingualism is valued and at what level it's valued, right? So how are you, like in elementary school, gonna tell a parent to stop speaking Spanish to their kid because it's like taking away from their education, but then in high school encourage that same kid to take a foreign language because foreign language is great and for your college application and to be able to go to other places where that learning was already happening at home and just in a different way. So then it's not valued because it's not happening in a high school class in in four walls. So I think also like the restrictions around that and how we frame language learning and again, like who we consider it valuable, like when it's coming out of their mouth, because I think there are a lot of maybe wealthier families that pay for language immersion schools and for this experience of like, I want my kid to have a leg up in the world, so they're going to know multiple languages, where a bunch of immigrant kids already know multiple languages. And yeah, it's going to take them a little bit to catch up on their English, but if you just kind of let that happen naturally, it really does, because kids are at an age where we were talking about the shame factor earlier, where they have they're a lot less embarrassed. So they're willing to make these mistakes and willing to kind of learn, but they also learn shame, right? So if you tell them like, stop speaking Spanish because like you need to be speaking English because you're in an English space and most of their spaces are going to be English spaces, well, then of course, like the Spanish is going to take a back burner. And it does require extra work on educators to kind of be patient with these kids that are learning these different languages. But I mean, there have been plenty of studies that like these kids catch up, when they get to middle school, to high school. But it does take this reframing of thinking of like, this kid isn't language deficient. They have tons of languages. And it's in our best benefit to nurture both. So yeah, I think this pull of a focus on just English in primary school, and then later you can learn a foreign language. It's bad because I think if you learn them simultaneously, then they're just kind of in your brain, where if you learn them later, you have to be very intentional about when and how to use them.
And I think, Lina, to your point, one of the things, I don't know if any of you have followed Dr. Jose Medina. I love him. He's great. If you guys haven't
on TikTok, let's go.
On TikTok, he's great. But he did a TikTok not too long ago about this very thing where, we have students who are not Spanish speakers and are fighting for their dual language school in their district, that has money. But then when you see how many Latino students are actually in that classroom, it's very small. Why? Because they don't speak the Spanish the way that the teacher is asking them to speak it, or they don't know why they change the tense, because this is something that they're naturally doing, right? And so what ends up happening is the withdrawing from these dual language schools, and it becomes, oh, bravo, Brian, for speaking Spanish. No, Juanito, don't speak Spanish. And it's really us trying to, I think, make sure that as educators and us, right, keep fighting for that pride of being who we are, pride of our language, but no matter how, if you could write it, not write it. One of our very first Joven was Lady Johanna, and who is now our administrative manager. And she came to me and said, hey, can you open up a classroom for me as a high schooler? Because I don't know how to read and write in Spanish. I could speak it, but I don't know how to read and write it. She's now our administrative manager and reads and writes in Spanish because she immersed herself and really practiced. And she had that confidence to say, you know what, no, I have a value in my language. And I think what we really need to push that more. And in these dual language spaces, get some more Latinos up in there and get some proper training to our educators about how do you really create a safe space for not only dual language learners or second language learners, but heritage language learners, which is a very different way of teaching Spanish.
That preservation of language and history knowledge, it takes work, and it is definitely not to be shied away from. To your point, Jenice, like that is it's so valuable to when we also see it as we're preserving a legacy too, right? Like the connections that we have to our family members or to our grandparents or to their grandparents, right? Like it just keeps going back as we get into the personal nature of it. And I see where I'm like, how is this an hour gone already? What is this is flying. But I think one other piece too that I've been thinking about a lot is, since we are talking about Latinx identity too, that we are who we are. If you are, if that is your heritage, that and then you get even more specific to your respective culture, right? Like you get to exist in your existence, if that makes any sense. Like that is you are Latina, Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, whatever respective culture you are by just existing. So the level of communication that you have with certain languages does not define your Latinidad, unless you want it to, right? Unless you choose that to be part of your journey and part of your value system. But if you do or you're not, there's no value statement there. You get to just exist, right? And you get to just lean into that. And I feel like there's so much freedom in that, of like, I get to just exist, and that's, check off on the self-worth piece like that. There's all these, I think, messages that have really distorted that feeling of belonging in the identity that is not true, right? We get to be complex. We get to be, have all these nuances. And then I want an extra layer too, is where I think it frustrates me sometimes, when, especially Latino, right? The term is based on geographic location, right? It's not necessarily on language. So then we're including Brazil, we're including, indigenous populations too. So the dominance or the mindset or assumption that people have that Latinos just speak Spanish, or that's the only way to connect with our populations, excluding out a lot of people, especially those who speak Portuguese or indigenous languages. And so really trying to check our assumptions and making sure we're getting to know, especially on an individual basis, when we have 20 students in your classroom, that's who you need to get to know. Like you can look at the data, and the data can inform, and the research is going to come in handy, especially when you have students that match up with what the identities that that research is studying. But we cannot lean in, take the first step with the assumption that, oh, this is the experience that all these students are bringing into the space. Like we have to build those relationships, and that means getting to know people on a personal level, which I think, especially based on the way that sometimes classrooms and educational spaces are built, are not allowing that personal connection. And so it's really tricky, especially we've been talking about culture too, and part of the values of being relational is a big piece of the culture too. So leaning into that, I just wanted to name that, because I think at the same time, we can see though how the history and the larger cultural context of Spanish has been very much racialized, very much excluded, because of race. And so that is something else to, as we get into the ratio linguistics piece that I've been learning a lot about, that is like how, and I think there was a quote that really shook me, was looking, let me see, I'm going to butcher it though, but here we go. Sounding like a language, or sounding like a language, looking like a looking like a language, sounding like a race. And that how that piece is based on people and how they look, and people making assumptions on them and how they speak, and then also the oppression that comes with that journey of just based on how you look too, and how that connects to language. Anyways, I'm like already rifting too far, I'm gonna bring it back, but I'm like, there's so much there, right? And to unpack. So the last question we have, and then I am so curious if our audience has, and we'll start to bring in some of these comments too, because we have some time, but is also, we've talked to kind of educators and facilitators. I'm curious to flip to Latinx youth or people on this call that I do identify as Latinx. What do you wish that they knew about maybe language's role in Latinx identity development, or anything else that you wish you could share with them right now? What would it be? And whoever wants to go first can go first.
I can go. I think the role is whatever you want it to be, right? Because I think if your family has been here for generations and none of you speak Spanish anymore, does that make you any less Latinx? No. if like, again, they have been here for generations, but you decided to pick up Spanish in high school and now Spanish is a huge part of your life, and like you went to a Latin American country and really felt at home there and found community there, and like now it's something maybe you want to pass down to your children or like to speak with your friends, like that's up to you to claim. I mean, for me, it's a huge part of my identity. Being born in Mexico, like that's how I communicated the first 10 years of my life, like almost exclusively. So I've gotten to be really immersed in both my Spanish and in my English. My sister, who is 12 years younger than me, sorry, she was born here and her only experience has been being in the United States, and her relationship with Spanish looks very different than my relationship with Spanish. And we have like the same genetic makeup. So is she less Latina than me because she feels really uncomfortable with her Spanish? Like, I don't think so. So again, it's hard to kind of step up and own your narrative and to claim it, even if it breaks societal norms. But just sometimes for your own mental like well-being, you just kind of have to push through and do it anyway. So I think that's really hard, but I think how you see your Spanish defining your Latinx identity is totally up to you.
Mm-hmm. I second all of that. I think that, yes. And I think too, you know, one of the things is that our youth navigating identity without, not even language aside, right, is hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's a struggle. You navigate, you know, middle school, high school, even into college, where you're really trying to find your true self. And I think that when it comes to our family, our culture, our languages, where are those values at? If language is part of that, great. If it's not, like Lina said, that's fine too. I think that one of the things that I look at and I just love so much about where we are right now is that you can pick up wherever you want. If you want to pick up today and say, you know what, no, I'm gonna do my Facebook lives in Spanish, even if it is Spanglish, or say, no, yo hablo Spanglish. Like that is what it is. That is okay. And being okay in that skin. And our jóvenes, I think, more and more so are speaking up for themselves, and they should, right? When they're in a classroom space and someone tells them, hey, you know, you need to speak English. Actually, I don't. Like, you need to learn Spanish. Okay, let me tell you the value that there is in being bilingual. Like, you know, and really putting it out there, because I think that our youth sometimes, and I go back to this one youth that really, him saying that being Latino was a curse. The first few times I read that, it was for an essay. I was taken back, because I was like, wait, a curse? That wasn't the same, you know, experience that I had. I was always very proud of it, even through people telling me that I shouldn't be proud. And so, you know, how do we help our youth find those people that could also uplift that and could help guide through that? I think is super important. And that the youth know ISLA's always here.
Let's go. Okay, that the resources are here now, which is so amazing and incredible and healing too, right? As we talk about the journeys and the hardship and the hurt that's come from that, trying to navigate. So I'm going to read a few comments in the chat, and we did get one question, so we'll get there in a second, because I think they're all these comments are related. But Jasmine sharing Spanish is a gem but not a standard. Oof, that was real. Shaming so Anna sharing that shaming bilingual people is such a hypocritical thing to do, because monolingual people wish they had the language skills that we have, but somehow because of our accent, Spanglish or the space to express in a bilingual way are never the right moments or places. Oof, getting deep here. And then Emily sharing that language has been a huge confidence issue for her, especially in terms of Latinidad or her Latinidad. But as she's learning more Spanish, she's also learning about the other aspects that make her Latina, which is really huge. So this question, I think that's tying into this piece about confidence. So, and this is coming from Elena. So said in the ask, here we go. So if confidence is a huge factor in language retention and children are able to learn languages more quickly because they allow themselves room for mistakes, how do we approach this as adults who lack the confidence and don't allow themselves room for mistakes, but want to expand on their bilingualism, which this is huge, right? Like as we've talked about, needing to go through healing ourselves, something that we can then, project, promote language inclusion to our young people too. Like it starts with us, like we've been talking about as well. So I don't know if y'all have already some thoughts on this one, but I think this is also things that I'm seeing in the chat.
You want to go first, Lina? Or?
Yeah, I'll go. I think something that's huge is finding a community that you feel supported in. And that's not always at home, honestly. Because sometimes I think there's this weird tension with parents, especially if they feel insecure about their English and you feel insecure about your Spanish, then you are kind of coming at it from both kind of like a defensive and insecure place where they'll be like, oh, like they'll take jabs at your Spanish and you'll take jabs at their English, and it's just not productive, right? So I think finding people that have similar experiences than you do, and again, comfort level is huge. So feeling safe to make those mistakes. And if you have Latino, Latina, Latinx friends in college and you guys kind of want to start just like having dinners where you're very intentional about like, today we're going to speak Spanish and today just Spanglish or whatever comes out of your heart and out of your soul, like do that. If you just like, if today's English and like that's how your feelings are coming out, then that's how they're coming out. But I think this thing of feeling supported and safe is huge because, language is about communication and it does kind of require an extra person. So if you're feeling very intentional about it, but you're just kind of speaking to the air and speaking in a void, like that's not really helpful either, right? And then sometimes understand that, if people have certain reactions to either your English or your Spanish, it's probably coming from an insecure place. So it, again, easier said than done, but not letting other people's expectations of you limit you, or letting other people's comments or ideas about what should come out of your mouth and how it should come out really stop you from expressing your truth and your identity.
Yes, I second all of that too. I mean, I think that first thing that you said is finding that space, right? A comfortable space, but a space where you feel like you can practice. I think that like with anything, when you want to learn a new skill or when you want to work on it, practice makes perfect. And so finding ways to do that. I mean, one of the things that I find it very hard for me in comprehension of Spanish is my reading. I'm not a good reader even in English. So I have to read in Spanish 3 times more than I have to do in English to be able to comprehend it. But I do it. And now it's getting down to 2. And soon, hopefully, it'll be that I'll be able to read it 1 time and we're good. But it's really putting in that kind of extra in it if it's really something you want to commit to. And with that confidence, we say it's easier for children, but sometimes we got to get into the youth of ourselves, right? We be kids. It's okay. Lina, you said earlier about learning a new language of like you were okay with it not being the best, and so I think we need to be a little bit more patient with ourselves and know that like children, we go to those people to give us that motivation and take language learning and take digging into that Spanish as that new skill that you're adding to your toolbox, that new tool that you're adding to your toolbox, because it really is something that is a benefit to the whole community. And so, yeah.
I love this so much. And I know we're right at time, so I'll wrap us up. But thank you to the audience here. I feel like one piece about this question that we've been talking about in a lot of our Facebook Lives, actually, it's like coming full circle, is about consciousness raising. And that is, we started off that conversation with Dr. Anise Fisher, who shared tools to raise your consciousness. And I think specifically consciousness raising is so important for mindset shifts, because really if we're dealing with a lack of confidence, then we have to shift our mind. And the fact that we have the power within ourselves to do it is, 1, exciting, and 2, it gives us something tangible to latch on to, of like, okay, so I'm getting in touch with my power, which, how do I do that? 1, I have to choose to lean into that power. So it starts with, I think, a choice, which then in the ways that her tools break it down, is the next level is getting really keen aware of yourself and like where are those feelings of insecurity coming from, really getting to the root of that, because then we can start to release it, because then we know where it's coming from and we're aware of ourselves. And I think the last two pieces is being present, trying to be really aware, showing up, that's the other piece there. And last but not least, but intention, like what are we leaning into? Are we gonna, I'll say I'm leaning into practicing Spanish, and by leaning, the energy I want to put at it is that I want to let myself make mistakes. I'm not going to strive for perfection. I'm going to strive for progress, and just being really intentional as you go through that journey. I mean, making sure your expectations too of yourself are also realistic, right? And kind and patient, which I think Lina and both Jenice have been bringing into this journey. It is also work, right? And I think this idea that it's going to come easy, let go of that one, because it is definitely, it is challenging, but that's part of the growth, right? That's part of what you're going to be able to see progress from, because you're making an investment. And this last piece that Lina, you just nailed, was this piece about other people's reaction to you as you practice, finding that safe space, but then also knowing that, let's say if somebody does tease you or makes comments or whatever that person is doing is a reflection of them. It's not a reflection of you. And that piece, we can take that lesson and apply it to so many different areas of our life, but especially this journey of language is like whatever somebody else, their vibes that they're throwing out, that's about them. That has nothing to do with you. And all you are responsible for is your own actions, the way that you're showing up. And that's all that you can control. So that's how we get to manage our energy a little bit better too, because we're not sucking up that energy. We're saving ours and preserving ours, because we know, right, that is about them. It's not about us. And so those are pieces that I feel like have been coming up a lot as we talk about identity too, is because how do we raise that consciousness about ourselves? And it is part of that path towards healing, which is really exciting to be on together and collectively as a community. So as we wrap up today, just thank you so much to Jenice and Lina for coming through and sharing your stories and your truths and your work, because we were learning so much from your leadership and from your own journeys too. And thank you to the audience too. Thank you for showing up and coming through with some juicy comments and questions. I'm loving it. So I'll throw it to you. I don't know if you have any last words as we wrap up, but wow, an hour flew. Juicy conversations.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for having the space. And Lina, thank you for all the work that you're doing in that world, in that space, and really digging into research, because I think it is a space that we need more people, and we need more representation of us, of really understanding our identity and where to go to, right? To really see how this is happening all over the country. It's not just specific to the South, and it is a little different sometimes in the South too, right? Some of the other issues that exist here. But, to what you said, Elaine, it's the progress. It's not about, having to meet expectation. And we're in a society where there are these standards that we're supposed to hit constantly, and it exists everywhere. And when it comes to language in our youth, do what you can. And it's all about bettering yourself little by little every day. So thank you.
Yeah, just want to repeat a lot of that, and really reiterate this point of like, whatever way that you're producing your identity is valid, and there's not one way to be Latinx. So really just like show up and exist. Like that's hard enough to do already. And again, if Spanish is something that you feel like you need in order to feel more included in the community, or maybe just because you want to be able to talk to your grandma on the phone, like that's like whatever reason you're coming into it with, it's valid and important. And also wanted to thank Jenice for her time and for her work, and been learning more about ISLA, and like the work that you guys do is super valuable and honestly like life-saving for a lot of people. So yeah, thank you for this conversation. I'm sure all of us could go on and on about this. So it was hard keeping it under an hour, but glad that we got to do it anyway.
Yeah, and shameless plug as we wrap up then is that for those that are listening and you're wondering how you can be a part of this movement, one, you can, which is really exciting. So follow ISLA, share. I also say like we need programs like ISLA, Latinx Ed, all the things that we're producing, right, from these organizations to continue, right? We need to invest too in these organizations and the work that we're doing because you see the demand, you see the need, it's huge, and we also need to invest too. So whether that looks like money, maybe that looks like time, maybe that looks like volunteering, maybe that looks like getting the word out. Like there's so many different ways that you can use your power and your voice and your resources to really help push these missions forward, and they are so needed. So shameless plug there. Got to add a little plug there because
Everything, please.
yes, share this, maybe sharing this video, come through. Yeah, there's so many ways to be a part of this. And so thank you for everything. And both of you, thank you so much. Again, I'm excited. I feel like we always need a part 2 for these conversations. So maybe part 2 maybe comes soon. So we'll see. But thank you all again. Have a great rest of your week and take care.
Yes. Bye.
Bye.